Welcome to the Putting Your Business on the Map podcast. My name is Landon Blake. I am your podcast host. Thank you for listening. Welcome to the podcast. If you're curious and you'd like to learn more, we have a special page for the podcast up at www.landonblake.com. Make sure you check that out. We've got our show notes there. You can also download the podcast in your favorite audio format. You should also be able to find the podcast on Spotify and on YouTube. So we've got the podcast episodes in both of those places. So if you use one of those apps or services, you can subscribe to the podcast there. Full disclaimer, I record most of these episodes at my home in Stockton, California. I am married to a crazy Mexican woman, and I have 2 dogs, so you may hear her or the dogs during the podcast episode. I just want to warn you ahead of time. I love all 3 of them, but they are noisy. So if you would like to sponsor a private recording studio for the podcast, make sure you reach out to me and let me know that. Otherwise, you may have some background noise. So with that disclaimer out of the way, we're going to jump right into today's episode. Welcome to episode number 11. The title of this episode is Can Clients Rely on Your Deliverables? So I don't know that we're going to answer that question for you in this episode, but we are going to talk about why the question is important, and hopefully I'll get you to think a little bit about if clients can rely on your deliverables. So this is the second episode I'm doing that's based on either an article or chapter in a book or something. So this actually came from our article that was in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, and it's a true story, true life story. So this actually happened, and it's about a group of investors that sued a financial auditor, and they basically alleged that the auditor didn't do a proper job on the audit, and that caused them to invest in a company that had major financial problems. And when those financial problems came to light, the stock lost a bunch of value and the investors lost a bunch of money. So the basic premise of the lawsuit was, can the investors sue the auditor? They did a certified audit. Can they sue the auditor if the auditor was basically grossly negligent? And the short answer to that is the court, I believe it was the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, said, no, investors, you can't rely on that. And so that caused a little bit of an uproar. It's one of the reasons why it was in the Wall Street Journal. But so you might be thinking, well, what does that have to do with land surveying or mapping? I think it helps us as business owners consider some interesting issues related to liability and what I call deliverables. You could call them work products. I like to call them deliverables. And this idea of, can somebody really rely on your deliverable as a land surveyor or a mapper? So what are we going to talk about in the episode? I'm going to describe to you who the players are, because there's, 3 or 4 or 5 the players that were in this dispute that went to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. I'm going to explain just a little bit about the process of auditing public companies. We're not going to get way deep into that. I'm just going to give you a super basic summary. I'm not an expert, but I learned enough to understand the case. We'll talk about what happened in the case. I kind of gave you a preview. We'll go in a little more detail. And then we'll talk about, what does this teach us as land surveyors about how clients rely on our deliverables? So what are we not going to talk about today? I'm not going to teach you in this episode how to do QA/QC. That's a whole different topic. Maybe a different episode. And we're not going to do a deep dive into risk management. That's a related topic. I do want to talk some more about risk management, but we're not going to do a deep dive in this episode. So who are the players in this dispute? So you have to know who the SEC is. That's the Securities and Exchange Commission. That is a federal government agency that sets the rules for issuing, marketing, and trading basically stocks and bonds. So that was a federal government agency that was basically created after the Great Depression to try and make sure that, everyday investors weren't getting conned basically by the people selling stocks and bonds. The company that was being audited in this case was called AmTrust. They are a company that sells insurance to small businesses, and they are, in fact, still a viable entity. So you can actually go and buy insurance for them right now. In fact, if you have a small business, one of your insurance policies might be from AmTrust. BDO is an audit company. So they review and check business finances, and they do that according to a standard set of rules, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. So BDO was the auditor or the audit company. AmTrust was the company that was being audited. It was an insurance company. Okay, the last player that you got to know about here is the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the PCAOB. That is a group of people that come together and set the rules for how public companies have to be audited. In other words, there was a requirement, I don't know when the law passed, but at some point there was a requirement that publicly traded companies, so the companies regulated by the SEC, that those companies publish, I think it's annual financial audits, right? So if some third party comes in and checks their books and then tells the investors, basically, do they get a passing grade or not on their financials? Okay, so the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board sets the rules for those audits. Now, one thing that's a little bit tricky here is that the company being audited pays for the audit. So that sets up a little bit of a misaligned incentive. And we have the same problem with rating agencies for other types of bonds, like mortgage bonds. So that means that auditors have to compete to win the business, to win the opportunity to audit a company. And so you can see how that creates a misaligned incentive there, right? Auditors that give bad audits tend to not get audited, tend not to get hired by companies. So there's this unspoken pressure to give a good audit, I think. Now, what constrains that? Well, the idea that auditors can be held liable if they don't do a good job should be a constraint on that impulse to give good audits where they aren't deserved. And that's part of the reason why I think folks got so upset about this court decision, is because the court decision basically removed that incentive. It basically said you can't hold auditors liable for a negligent or a fraudulent audit. And so a lot of people were saying at that point, well, given the incentives then that audit companies have, what's the point of even paying for an audit? Okay, so given that understanding of the incentives, let's talk a little bit about the actual audit process. So what happens? So as I mentioned, I believe it's once a year, the publicly traded company goes and hires an audit company. Okay, I believe there's 4 big ones. That's part of the problem, is there's too much consolidation in the market. I don't know if BDO is one of the big 4 or not. But if you're a publicly traded company, you have to go hire an auditor to do your audit. The auditor comes in and reviews your books as the public company. So, they get into your checkbook register. They look at how much money you have on your credit cards. They look at your revenue, income. They crawl through your books. And then the auditor certifies or doesn't certify that the company is in good financial health. That's basically, and as far as I can tell, it's like a pass-fail. They have a couple different categories, but it's basically a pass-fail system. So these guys aren't even giving the companies a letter grade like A through F. It's just, yeah, we think these guys are solvent, or no, we think they've got major problems in the future. Okay, so investors then use that, in theory, use those auditor certifications to decide whether or not to invest. So what that means is if your company gets a bad audit, if you fail your audit, your stock price is going to go down, or the interest rate you pay on bonds is going to go up, because you're going to be viewed in the marketplace as more risky, and investors are going to want to be compensated for that risk. That's how it works in theory. So the interesting part about that is, in theory, these audits are really important, and they're important because investors rely on them to make decisions. So this controls how some money flows around to companies. And it controls in part what companies pay to borrow money on the bond market. So in theory, these audits have some pretty some pretty major financial consequences. So you could think about it in a way like a survey, like an Alta survey, for example, that can have a pretty dramatic impact on the value of a property or potentially, or as I've talked about in some other episodes on whether or not, a real estate transaction closes or doesn't close. So it's a similar dynamic. That's why I wanted to talk about it. Okay. So what happened in this case? That's the third point that I wanted to cover. So AmTrust, the insurance company, hires BDO, the auditor, to perform their audit. This is a few years ago. So BDO goes in, they do the audit, kind of, and they give AmTrust a clean bill of health. So they certify the audit and they say, don't worry, investors, AmTrust is in good financial health. And then not too long after that, and it wasn't super clear to me how long after, but it wasn't years. It was a few months or maybe a year at the most. Turns out there were some financial problems at AmTrust. Not enough to make them go bankrupt, but they shouldn't have probably gotten a passing grade on the audit, basically. And we know this because the SEC and the Public Company Accounting Board, they go in and they do some accusations are made. They go in and do some investigations and they find out, BDO did a half-baked job. And they didn't just miss a couple things, like they were grossly negligent. Like the senior auditors at the company that were signing off on the audit, like didn't even check what the junior technical staff had prepared. And the junior technical staff didn't even do, just sounds like from reading some of my research that they did it really bad. It was half-baked. They did a bad job on this audit. It wasn't even close to being a proper audit. So the investors who had bought AmTrust stock between the time when the audit was certified, given a passing grade, and when all this information came to light, the stock price tanks, and so they sue BDO for the difference, for the drop in the value of their stock. So this goes to court, goes all the way up to the Second Court of Appeals, the appeals court for the Second Circuit, and the appeals court says, sorry, investors, but BDO, the auditor, isn't liable to you for that audit. And the court found in their decision that BDO was not liable, even though the court agreed they didn't do a good job on the audit. So it wasn't that the court went in and said, no, investors, you're wrong. BDO did a good audit, and there was just some other things going on here. They told the investors, yeah, you're right. BDO did a crappy audit, but you can't rely on it. So why would the court make that decision? I was really puzzled, as I'm sure a lot of people in the marketplace were. Well, I don't think the court was crazy. After I read the appeals court decision and some of the other research, I think I understand now why the court reached the decision it did. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. So let me try and explain what I think the court was reasoning on. So they said, look, BDO uses a standard form from the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. There's a standard form they have to use. It's a pretty short form. Did they pass the audit or did they not? Doesn't provide a lot of detail. So the court said, hey, that standard form is just too general to really be relied on by investors. Like investors, if you really want to know what's going on with the company, you can't rely on the public audit. You got to go in and sniff around, kick the wheels, do your own investigation. So they said, hey, the standard audit is just too general and it doesn't give enough information to really be relied on. Okay, so just about everybody in the business world, of publicly traded companies, except for this Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, flips out when this decision comes down. So that includes the SEC and the SEC, some past directors of the SEC. Everybody gets super upset. They submit, letters to the court and said, you guys got this wrong. This is going to cause huge problems. And so one of the things that the SEC tells the Second Court of Appeals is, hey, in 2022, the last year the information was available that I could find, auditors made $17 billion auditing public companies. Why are we spending all that money And why is that a government requirement if the court's going to find that investors can't rely on it? If that's true, then just, get rid of the requirement to audit companies. I mean, that's not exactly what they said, but that was the basic logic. So they said, $17 billion is a lot of money. And so I think the SEC has a good argument there. And they talk a little bit about, hey, we know it's a standard form, but, the standard form is to try and make this accounting information a little easier for the investing public to digest. And, your average investor shouldn't have to read a 2,500 page audit. That we should be able to rely on professional auditors to summarize that information and highlight the risks. So it was a good argument, I think, that the SEC made and that some related parties made to the court. Now, at the time I recorded this podcast, that issue hasn't been resolved. So I believe the Second Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, said they were going to go back in and take another look at that. So they told the SEC and some other parties that submitted briefs or letters to the court, yeah, you're right. This is probably something that we need to go back in and look at. So as I mentioned, I understand why the appeals court made the decision it made. The audit form is basically a pass-fail grade. There's not a lot of detail, so you can kind of think about it. I was just trying to think, how do I illustrate that to you guys, to the listeners? And I thought about it. I thought about this illustration. So, in my part of California, we have a lot of food trucks, a lot of taco trucks. I like them. I like to eat them. Like to eat at taco trucks. But you got to be careful what taco trucks you eat from. You can get sick. Now, in my part of California, taco trucks get a health inspection just like a restaurant. Okay, but normally when you see, at least in my county, when you see those, you can see that the taco trucks have to post the results of the last health inspection. It's basically a pass-fail grade, right? So they don't tell you that the inspection form doesn't tell you a lot about the taco truck. It doesn't tell you how likely you are to get sick. It doesn't tell you if you were going to get sick, what if this taco truck might make you sick. It doesn't let you know, were there any issues on the last inspection that got flagged, even though they still got a passing grade. They don't tell you, has the taco truck ever failed an inspection? How long ago was that? There's a lot of information there that's a lot of information that's not in the pass-fail grade, right? And that's kind of the argument that the appeals court was making, and I'm sympathetic to that. Now, I think the way to fix that is you provide a little more information on the audit. You don't tell auditors that they don't have to be liable for being negligent or fraudulent. And so, like I mentioned before, if the court said, hey, investors, before you go buy a bunch of stock in a company like AmTrust, you better go kick the tires a little bit. Don't just rely on the public audit. So, this really stinks, right? Like the status quo stinks. So the government required companies to get audits. Companies spend billions of dollars every year getting audits, and then essentially another branch of the government turns around and says you can't rely on these audits that you paid for. So that's not a good system. Something has to change here, right? You either got to change the audits so that people can rely on them, or get rid of the requirement for the audit and just go back to Wild Wild West, right? So how do you fix this? So in the brief that the SEC submitted to the Court of Appeals, it said, hey, SEC, you should let investors sue audit companies for half-baked audits. That doesn't mean the investors always have to win, but you should at least give the investors a chance to go to court and prove their case. And if the investors can prove that the auditor was fraudulent or negligent, they should be entitled to damages. Okay, so very interesting case. Not fully resolved yet. And something it probably is going to get fixed here. I suspect we're not going to get rid of in the United States, we're not going to get rid of the requirement to audit public companies. So I suspect either the Court of Appeals is going to find that investors can indeed hold somebody like BDO liable, or I suspect that the audit form will get changed to provide some more information, and as a result, you will be able to sue auditors if they're negligent. Okay, so interesting story. I hope you guys didn't fall asleep. I hope that was somewhat interesting to you. So the question that brings up is what does that teach us now as land surveyors and mappers? Is this an issue that we confront in our own profession and businesses? Absolutely, yes. It is absolutely an issue. In fact, I thought about a couple different scenarios that have happened to me just in the last 2 or 3 years that touch on this issue of, are your deliverables, can they be relied upon by the client? So I'm going to give you two examples, just two, and there's probably more, but I'll give you two examples. So one is there was a boundary dispute that I got hired to work on. So I went out. I believe I was the first surveyor out. I went out, did a boundary survey, did a good job. Spent several $1,000s, prepared a good exhibit, was working with the lawyer. So a couple months after that, I get a call from the attorney I'm working with, and he says, "Hey, the neighbor on the other side got a survey. Can I send it to you to look at?" The other surveyor said, "You got it all wrong." I said, "Sure, send me the survey." So they sent me the survey, and it was done by a young LS. I ended up talking to the guy, so I have a little bit of sympathy for him because I don't think he had a lot of experience. But make a long story short, he had made some pretty serious accusations about shoddy work on my part. I get his survey, and there's a big nasty disclaimer on his survey that says this isn't a real boundary survey and you can't use it as a boundary survey. So I said, well, that's interesting. So I called the guy up, and I asked the attorney, I said, can I call the other surveyor and talk to him? He said, sure. So I called the surveyor up and I said, hey, I understand you and I don't agree on how to resolve this boundary. I said, that's okay. I said, but you can't fire shots at my work product, my deliverable, when you've got this big nasty disclaimer painted on your deliverable, bro. I'm like, did you do a boundary survey or not? Because either you did a boundary survey and you can dispute the results of my survey, or you did something else that isn't a boundary survey, and then you can't use whatever that half-baked thing is to dispute my boundary resolution. And so he said, okay, yeah, let me think about that. You're probably right. So anyways, I called my attorney back and I said, hey, if for some reason this goes to trial and this exhibit gets submitted as evidence, like I think we need to, you need to tear this guy apart on cross. And he's like, yeah, you're right. He says, don't worry about it. I think it's going to settle, but yeah, you're right. He can't attack the work that you've done with something that has that kind of disclaimer on it. So there's an example of, now I know because I found out through the grapevine, he got paid a fraction of what I got paid to do the actual job. So I don't know. I think we got more than $10,000 for that whole deal. And I think I found out he ended up getting like $1,200 or $1,500. So, yeah, that's no bueno, right? You're not getting paid to do a proper job. And then you throw some disclaimer on your deliverable that basically says it can't be relied on, but then you give that to a lawyer so he can go after another surveyor. Like, it's not too bright. It's not very smart. So another example that came up, and this is more recent. This is just in the last few weeks, but I was on a call for a nonprofit that I do some volunteer work with, and one of the things that had come up was whether or not departments of transportation, state departments of transportation, should be able to rely on 3D models that are provided by the civil engineer. And a lot of civil engineers are like, no, you can't rely on the model. And their clients, the departments of transportation, are like, why not? Why can't we rely on the model? We should be able to rely on your model. It's a deliverable. And so there's a lot of back and forth there. I'd like to maybe we'll do an extra. I'll do an extra for the folks that support us on Patreon. I'll do a 10 or 15 minute extra and talk a little bit about what I think some of the issues are there. But it's the same basic problem, right? Can the client rely on your deliverable or not? So when we think about that, what are some of the lessons for us as land surveyors and mappers? Okay, so I've got 4 of them. I'll go through them one at a time. I'll try and go slowly. So number 1, first lesson: if a client pays you for a deliverable, they should be able to rely on that deliverable within some agreed limits. I'm not telling you they should be able to use your deliverable for purposes it wasn't intended for, but you and your client should agree on how they can rely on the deliverable ahead of time. And then when you provide the deliverable, they should be able to rely on it. And the degree of reliance on the deliverable should be reflected in the price. So think about the example I told you about the boundary dispute. Now, the client got what they paid for in that case for the neighbor. The neighbor got what he paid for. He paid for a deliverable he couldn't rely on, and that's what he got. Okay, but the surveyor might as well have burned that guy's $1,200, right? What he needed to tell the neighbor was, if you really want a deliverable that can be used in a court to challenge Landon's boundary resolution, I need $8,000 or $10,000 or $12,000, whatever the number was. Okay, so that's important. Think about that when you craft your scope of services, right? And when you're having initial conversations with the client. You and your client need to agree on how the deliverable can be relied on, and that should be negotiated ahead of time and put in writing. Don't word of mouth that, put it in writing. So some examples of issues that come up is, let's say we do a boundary survey, and the architect or engineer, we do a boundary topo for a site development, and the architect or the engineer, the client, let's say, asks us for CAD files of the boundary and topo for the architect or engineer. I don't have a problem with that within certain limits. So the civil engineer can't get their network GNSS rover out and go stake that boundary to verify setback. They can't use the drawing for that. That's the practice of land surveying. It's high liability. If somebody wants the boundary marked or staked or building setback verified, they have to hire me or another land surveyor to do that. I do not let architects or engineers do that based off of my CAD file. So now, if they want to rely on that CAD file, let's say, to locate a building in the design, I'm okay with that. That's an allowable use. That's within the limits, right? So you got to think about each of your deliverables and what the allowed uses are going to be. What can the client reasonably do with that deliverable? And you should talk about it. I'll give you one more example. We may do an aerial topographic survey, but I always let the client know you can't use this. You can't use this for hardscape design against existing hardscape. And why? Well, because it's not accurate enough in the vertical component. They say, well, we don't like that. And I say, I understand. No problem. We can charge you for some ground surveys, and we can do some we call ground infill topo. We can do that where you think you're going to have to match existing hardscape. We'll go survey that on the ground, and it'll be accurate, and we'll integrate that. We can blend that into the aerial. And then sometimes I have clients tell me, well, we don't want to pay for that. I'm like, okay, I understand, but you don't get both. You either get an aerial and you can't use it for hardscape design, or you get an aerial with ground infill and you can rely on it. But see, that's a conversation you have to have with your client. You don't want your client to think they're getting a topo that they can do hardscape design on if you're only doing an aerial, because that's usually not going to be good enough. So those are conversations you have to have. So that's lesson 1. Okay, lesson 2. And I mentioned this briefly, but it's got its own numbered item here. Lesson number 2: the more the limits are on the deliverable, the less the client should have to pay for the deliverable. Right? The fewer the limits on the deliverable, the more the client should have to pay. So we'll go back to the other example I talked about. Should a Department of Transportation be able to rely on the surface model provided by the civil engineer doing the design? Well, I would say it depends. Is the engineer being paid for that surface model, and how much? So DOTs don't get to have their cake and eat it too, right? Like, look, it doesn't make sense for the engineer to do a 3D model, provide 2D plans in PDF format, and then have the contractor recreate the 3D model. That's dumb. We're wasting money there, right? Okay, but if the civil engineer is going to be held liable for the 3D model, then the DOT should have to pay for that. They should have to pay. That should be more expensive than a 3D model that's just being handed over for free or not at all. So you have to evaluate the trade-offs there, right? Between how much can the client rely on this, or what are the different uses they can put this deliverable to, and what are they paying, right? And there's give and take there, but you have to think about it. Now, for the surveyors and mappers, before I leave that numbered item, that means you can't charge the client for a deliverable or a work product that they can rely on it, and then slap a disclaimer on the survey or the deliverable and tell them they can't rely on it. You don't get to do both. Okay, point number 3. There is a trade-off between ease of use and level of detail. And the reason I wanted to put this here is sometimes clients want to rely on the deliverable, but they don't want to deal with the level of detail they need for that corresponding level of reliance. Now that sounds a little technical, so let me try and explain. And I have 1 or 2 examples I can use. So I typically tell clients if they want me to deliver urban street topo in PDF format, that my horizontal scale needs to be 1 inch equals 10 feet. Because if they want 1 inch equals 20 feet or 1 inch equals 40 feet, I'm not going to be able to provide the level of detail they want to do a good design. Now, as an alternative to that, what I'll tell them is I will provide you PDFs at 1 to 40, but then I'm going to give you cleaned up point drawing or point file with the actual surveyed points. And you have to rely on that for your design, not the 1 to 40 PDF mapping. Now, sometimes engineers don't like that because they want to design on the PDF, but the problem you run into is you can't show enough information on a 1 to 40 horizontal scale mapping for most urban streetscape. There's too much going on. So the client has to choose. Either they can deal with mapping at a 1 to 10 inch scale or rely on a separate point drawing or point file, or they're going to lose the level of detail and they can't rely on it. So there's a trade-off there, right? Another example is sometimes we'll have clients, we'll do, my partner does UAV aerial LiDAR, and the actual process point cloud that we get off the end of our work out the bottom of our process is very detailed. So, it could be 2 or 3 or 10 or 12 terabytes of data. And a lot of times the client will say, well, we can't handle that. Can you decimate it or simplify it? And the answer is absolutely we can. You have to understand that when we do that, you will lose resolution. So if you have critical conform lines or critical break lines, you need to talk to us. You can't just have us, decimate this down to 1 return per square meter, and then do a detailed level design on it more than likely. So you have to be, when you think about how is a client going to rely on your deliverable, you have to consider this issue of level of detail. Okay. And what I might try and do is maybe I'll do an extra and we'll go in and we'll look at some examples. Maybe on the whiteboard, I'll do some examples of why that's important. And then finally, the 4th lesson is, when you think about the form that was at the heart of this case, the standard form, the SEC's argument was, it's a 1-page form. Sorry, guys, I just lost my camera. The SEC's argument was it's a 1-page form. Let me see if I can, it's not going to take. It's a 1-page form. Guys, you can't rely on it. And then, the response should be, well, if it's a 1-page form and we can't rely on it, why are we paying $17 billion a year for these audits? So I think there's an alternative there. And I think that alternative is you can work hard as a land surveyor to provide clarity and detail. So there doesn't have to be a trade-off between clarity and detail. So for example, maybe your typical investor doesn't want to read a 2,500 page audit report, but maybe it could be more than 1 page. Maybe it could be 12 page. Maybe you could give the company a letter grade, A to F. Maybe you could rank them on a score of 1 to 100 on 5 or 6 different key financial metrics. Like you could do the graphic design to where that was easily digestible, even by a Joe Blow average investor like I would be if I was going to buy stock or bonds. So I think there's a balance there, and I imagine that's probably some of the way that this issue with the public audits at this Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit will get resolved. So just remember, you can provide clarity and some more detail if you work hard sometimes. And so that's like the example, like we tell the client, okay, we'll give you 1 to 40 topographic mapping as PDFs, but we're going to give you this other information. We're going to give you this drawing with the points in it at 1 inch equals 1 foot scale, so that you can see all the points and identify, critical elevations, low points, high points, that kind of thing. All right. So let me give you an example of something you may not have thought about, but I had a good friend of mine, Kevin, talk to me about this the other day, and I hadn't really thought about it. But it dovetails in very nicely with this last point about the balance between clarity and detail. So, you can map easements on a boundary survey. Normally, when I do that, I don't show bearings and distances around the easement like I do the parent parcel. We usually we actually plot the easement per the measurements in the easement deed if we can do that, but we don't show all those measurements. We don't show differences between measure and record either. I don't even do that on an ALTA survey unless I'm asked to by the client. Now, do you do that or not? That's a lot of detail. And I think on most of my boundary surveys, that would be, it would really clutter the map up if I was labeling all the measurements on a 5-foot wide sewer lateral easement. But you got to think about that. I think it's project specific and client specific. So there's a lot of information about easements that you might want to convey to the client. Is there closure error in the easement deed? Does the easement cover the physical infrastructure, or is there encroachment? What's the source of the easement line work? Are there errors or easements? Are there errors or conflicts in the easement deeds or between the easement deeds and the parent parcel deed? So there's a lot of other information that might be important to the client. And so I guess part of what I'm arguing with the clarity and detail is maybe you don't have to go in and label the bearings and distances on every easement course, but maybe you have a table that points out any potential issues with easements based on your work. See, that's a way to provide clarity without the clutter of way more information than the client needs. And I would argue if you, the surveyor, go through and analyze the measurements and identify potential issues with the easements and put that in a table or add some notes to the map, that's probably more helpful to the client than providing all those bearings and distances, because the client's not going to know what that means. And so I think, that's a good example. We can do something like that with the public company audits, right? Like enough detail to help the investor make decision without all of the all the raw data, basically. All right. So to conclude, what did we talk about today? So I just covered a story from the Wall Street Journal. I'll try and remember to have Carly, who helps me with, she's a really nice young lady that helps me with the podcast. I'll try and remember to have her link to the Wall Street Journal article, which is behind a paywall, and the SEC brief, which is you can read for free. And if we can, we'll find the appellate court case. We'll try and link to all those in the show notes. Okay, so in review, what was this about? It was about a story of a public company audit that was fraudulent or negligent or both. So public audit went sideways. We talked about the different players involved, right? The SEC, AmTrust, BDO, the auditor, the public company, accounting oversight board. We talked about what went wrong with the audit. We talked about the court decision from the appeals court of the Second Circuit and the way different players in the public company market reacted to that. And then we talked a little bit about some lessons for land surveyors and mappers, right? On can clients rely on your deliverables? How much? What's the trade-off between reliance and price? That kind of thing. All right. So my next episode, this will be episode number 12. I think I'm going to talk about transparency with team members, which is an interesting, hopefully will be an interesting topic. We try to be super transparent with our team at Redefine Horizons. I've never worked at a company. I don't think that provides the level of transparency we want to do. Like all things in business, there are trade-offs to that transparency. So I want to talk about how we try and be transparent, some of the trade-offs, and maybe get you to think a little bit about the level of transparency at your business. If you would like to sponsor the podcast, let me know. If you sell a business or a service, quality business or service, and you'd like to reach people like me that are running a surveying or mapping business, let me know. It doesn't just have to be an advertisement. We can interview you, or I can review a product or service. So we have some different things, creative things we can do. The Patreon page isn't quite up yet, but it may be by the time this episode airs. So, if you want to chip in $10 or $20 a month, if you think the podcast is worth that, that would help me pay for Carly and the web hosting and some of the software subscriptions that I use to put the podcast together. It will also do a really valuable thing, which is let me know if the podcast is worth $10. At some point, if I can't get anybody to support me on Patreon, that may be a market signal that the podcast isn't worth the time I'm putting into it. So, it's just, I'm a strong believer in the free market and price as signal. So if you value the podcast and it's worth a cheeseburger and fries to you once a month, please go check out the Patreon page. We'll get that in the show notes, and you can support us on Patreon. So thanks for listening, guys, and I hope to catch you on episode 12. That's going to wrap up our episode for today. Once again, I want to thank you guys for listening. Appreciate that. Don't forget, you can check out the podcast, download episodes, view show notes at www.landonblake.com. You can also subscribe to the podcast on YouTube and Spotify. If you would like to be a guest on the podcast or you have a suggestion for a future topic for an episode, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find my contact information all over the web. Landon Blake, I'd love to hear from you, and we will catch you guys on the next episode. Thanks.